I can see you. Can you hear us?
I can certainly hear you. It's great to be with you. A very good morning to you all on
Fantastic.
International Women's Day.
It is indeed. Happy Women's Day to everybody. Thank you very much. We've just finished up our first panel discussion, Kat. I don't know if you had a chance to listen, but we were talking about the agricultural sector. Now we're going to be talking about living in the age of uncertainty. You are the keynote addresser for this section. Let me hand over the mic to you.
Well, thank you very much, moderator, and thank you very much to Professor Ilter, the chair, and a very warm to all ladies and gentlemen dignitaries. It is very much my pleasure to be here to kick off this excellent panel discussion to talk about leadership in an age of disruption and how to shape the future. This quote, I think, summarizes very nicely the challenge that we're facing. That the greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence, it is to act with yesterday's logic. And that is the challenge facing all of us. That what got us here as leaders is not going to help us necessarily lead into the future. So what I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes exploring is how do you both act decisively now, coming out of the pandemic as leaders, but also with an understanding of tomorrow's logic. Because the leadership challenge that is facing us is not just the next few months or years as we come out of the pandemic. It's also the fact that the 2020s and the 2030s have got profound existential ecological challenges facing us around biodiversity and climate change. We have profound challenges facing us in terms of growing inequality driven by technology. And we have a profound challenge in that the governance structures that have brought us to where we are now are not going to work in the future. So the challenge is, as leaders, how do you make decisive and courageous decisions in an environment where it's turbulent and it's unclear? How do you build vision, scenarios, strategy, plans, and policies when the environment is so turbulent and uncertain? And that, I guess, is the work that we do. We help translate insights from the future into decision-making today and help people think about the impact of their decisions on future generations. And I would probably leave you with two key insights on how you do that, okay? One is to systematically and methodically actively scan to spot signals of change and think through their implications. But the issue is, and I have up there a picture of my time when I was in the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit in the UK 15 years ago. We did the Sigma scan, which scanned the horizon, and there is a brilliant textbook scenario of the pandemic from 15 years ago, spot on. Also, we had good signals of Brexit, of what happens with the gig economy and impact on nation state taxation revenues. So the signals were there. The second question and the second key insight is, how do you as a leader create organizations to act on them? And that's the two issues that we're going to explore today. So taking the first, how do you explore the context that we're in? The pandemic that we're in is not a health one only. That will probably be finished by the end of next year, 2022. But the economic, political, social, and psychological crisis is going to be lasting a generation, and these are all linked. So how do you think about systematically the second order indirect implications of this upon your organizations, whether you are a company, a university, whether you're the media or a government? So we did some thinking for you. We've done some horizon scanning, which is what we call this kind of scanning of the horizon, plus a futures wheel to understand some of the implications. There's obviously a lot there, but here are 5 things that I think that you might be interested in. First of all, is that business and work has obviously been impacted. Large-scale shutdowns, patched up supply chains, unemployment, changes in where, who, and how people are working. And this is changing the shape of urban and rural communities. And the interesting fact about this is that the effect on labor markets, as always, is the losers who always lose out when there's economic pressures, the young, women, and minorities. And this is going to have an adverse lifetime impact on the lack of opportunities, the lack of social mobility, and the quality of life is going to be set back much more in poorer countries. But the difference this time around, as opposed to 10 years ago or 30 years ago, is that many of these groups are now much more active and mobilized around issues of inequality, like Time's Up, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, or the issues around intergenerational fairness. So the question is, how are governments, businesses, and communities going to respond? Are they going to reshape urban areas, invest in new job programs and infrastructure, social safety nets that doesn't leave anybody behind? And how they choose is going to make consumers, employees, and citizens feel very differently about them. The second point is that the last round of quantitative easing from central banks, basically over the past 10 years, has driven huge inequalities within and between countries. It went directly into the pockets of the rich. This time, as governments invest in order to come out of the economic crisis of the pandemic, there is a major opportunity to create new jobs in the new green economy. But there are 2 big uncertainties. One, will governments do that? Will they use quantitative easing to address and fund the transition to a sustainable global economy? And an important note to that, in that journey, are they actively ensuring that the costs of decarbonisation does not get borne by the poor, so it doesn't affect poverty alleviation measures? But the second uncertainty is, how does that uncertain glide path to decarbonisation, which is going to be a disruptive process from a political economy perspective, new actors, assets, where removing hydrocarbon rents is a positive influence on governance, but how does that intersect with the impact of climate change on, for example, sustainable livelihoods, on migration from rural to urban areas? So especially how that plays out in resilient and more fragile countries is going to be a key defining feature of the next few decades. The third point is around the fact that the pandemic has made it clearer more than ever that we are now in a bipolar world. The era of Pax Americana is over. But after a decade of populism and nation state interests first, we are coming to a sense that there are global public goods like health and that need multilateral cooperation. And we will certainly need international cooperation in the face of the crises that will follow the pandemic, whether it's debt crises, economic, and the likely political and possibly military conflict that's going to come out as the pandemic washes through over the next 5 years. We need well-managed frameworks to ensure that we can respond as a global community. But again, the uncertainty is, will nation states and international organizations have the courage to embrace the new kinds of ideas that are out there about macroeconomics, innovation, the role of the state, and to transform global governance and invest in global agencies to respond to human need? Or are they going to be stuck in the past? The pandemic has also demonstrated that health is actually a strategic issue. This was the fourth insight. It's shone a spotlight on the importance of mental health, the value of clean environmental spaces, and the importance of safe homes without domestic violence or family abuse. And as the death toll increases, it becomes clear, as the Lancet says, that this is a syndemic. There are systematic inequalities in our societies that sit behind health conditions and how we provide healthcare. So the question is, will governments finally develop policies to address the social determinants of health and ensure that the private sector supports that? Where are the opportunities to transform healthcare through the vaccine rollout? And can we transform health systems in order to provide for prevention and to maximize health and well-being, rather than as a service that addresses emergencies and sickness? And the final shift and big story of the next 10 years that I'd like to bring out is about technology. And it's become very clear that the interests of these big US technology companies around social control, disinformation, privacy, ownership of data is not the same as our interests of the rest of us. And what's been notable is that governments are now going to be a lot more willing to tackle and regulate these companies. And as for data and digital, so for other forms of emerging technology that are going to be coming down the horizon, whether it's synthetic biology, AI, etc. But the question again is, will businesses and governments come together to develop an effective regulatory approach, balancing those tensions in order to maximize well-being for all, and do so in a global cooperative way, as well as also thinking about what are the additional, it's not just about regulation, what are the additional enabling mechanisms and support that mean that emerging countries are not always dependent on the US and China and Europe for innovation. So, if you like, I've given you a very quick run through that first set of issues, which is how do you systematically think about the emerging signals and the implications for you as the world changes. Let's now turn to the second challenge, which is, once you've identified the signal from the noise, how do you make sure that you act on it as leaders? And that is not a given. The difference between Kodak and Konica Minolta was not that Kodak did not see the change coming in their sector. They saw the change coming and they were responsible for it. But in fact, they failed to act. So in our work and research and practice with leading practitioners from around the world, we find that leaders are unsurprisingly key to this, but it's not about your views on the future. It's about your ability to harness your community and your organization, your company, or your government around these three areas, around building a strong vision collectively, understanding the futures that you may not want, but that you need to be prepared for with your plan Bs, and building the infrastructure in your organization, early warning indicators, strategic suggestions, contingency plans that mean that your organization looks up and out. And in fact, the evidence shows that countries, companies, civil society organizations that do that have much better results. So René Rohrbeck says that that puts about 20 to 50% on the bottom line for companies. You have foundations like Lego Foundations, the International Federation of the Red Cross, Singapore, Finland are all examples of countries who have managed to be resilient and transform in turbulence. 3 suggestions as I come to the end of my talk on how you as leaders can potentially take that forward. So first of all, be stewards of performance now and in the future. How might you do that? Here are 3 ideas. You can assess your decisions today for intergenerational fairness. How do the costs and benefits of the decisions play out for generations alive today, the old and the young, but also generations in the future? Are you mortgaging your children's future, or are you doing the right thing for today and tomorrow? Secondly, you can nominate someone responsible for the future. Many countries now are increasingly thinking about, how can I set up a commissioner or ombudsman for future or next generations? Wales is there. And there are great examples in companies. For example, River Simple's Future Guardian model identifies 6 stewards who are there to look for the future and the past in 6 different areas, like clients, employees, etc. And it's your role to tell the story of your organization, your company, your country, that looks both from the past, the present, and into the future. And the interesting thing is that you may be the best person to tell the story from the past to the present, but you cannot tell the story into the future unaided. You need to do that with others. And that comes to my second point. These words are very easy to say, being open and courageous, that mindset of a leader, but it's important to be open, because you as a leader, can you remember I said, what got us here will not take us there. If you were in 1945 and you were the US government and wanted to know about the future of computers, you'd probably go to Thomas Watson from IBM. He did not know about the future. So the importance as a leader is to be humble and to actively seek those different points of view from different people about how the future may be, and weave that into your story. But then the important thing, and this is where the courage is you then need to be able to act before things are broken. So this ability to shift before you get to the crisis in order to prepare and be best positioned to the future, that is the real indicator of leadership quality. And there are some organizations that set the bar on that, like DSM from the Dutch former pharmaceutical company, or the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation, both of which who have really divested in recent years. And finally, I would say, as a leader, you can commit to building the institutional capacity of your organization or your ministry or your government to look and be prepared for the future, because this is not just for you. This is also finance, how you recruit, how you do your risk management, how you do your monitoring and evaluation and collective intelligence. And we've got a framework that can help you do that in a systematic way. So, final thoughts. I think the key challenge personally, when confronted with so much change, such a cognitive overload, how do you be undaunted and still brave and courageous in the face of all this change? And personally, I find the greatest support is by tapping into the next generation's, well, this generation too, sources of vision, imagination, hope, and inspiration. So we started off with a quote from an old white 20th century man about leadership. And I'm going to leave you with a quote on International Women's Day from a 24-year-old woman, Raya, based in Dubai. She's our next generation foresight practitioner winner. And she has set up Academy. She's redesigning the school of the future. So teenagers today can learn the skills that they need for the next 70 years to lead into the future. Her quote is inspirational. And so I'll leave you at that with leaders like her, who have this kind of mission to bring a sense of awe and wonder to education and inspire learners to bring about positive civilizational level change, that is the kind of leader that I want to see leading over the next 21st century. So at that, I will say thank you very much, and I look forward to the Q&A later on.
Thank you very much, Kat. I think you laid out some of the challenges very well and a comprehensive analysis of what the next decade might be looking like. All right, without much further ado, I'd like to call Mr. İlter Turan. You have about 30 minutes. We have the president speaking at 12:25, so I'll leave the floor to you, sir.
Thank you very much. This is an entirely virtual panel that I'm going to be chairing, and we began with Kat Tully. I would like to repeat what everyone else has said, that we have an important day today, Working Women's Day, being the son of a working mother, being the husband of a working lady, being the father of a working young lady. I am particularly pleased that we have this day where we can pay homage to our working female companions. Now, Kat Tully gave a very interesting beginning. When we were naming this meeting, we went back and forth between essentially uncertainty and disruption. I have a feeling these are two different concepts, but they are neatly intertwined, particularly in the event of the pandemic, which essentially introduced many elements of uncertainty into a process of what we might call as a paradigmatic shift in the way we operate. In fact, in her presentation, Kat referred to these things very effectively, but let me just, for the sake of argument, repeat them. There are disruptive forces in global politics. The end of the Cold War has led to the erosion of the system of global governance. Nothing has yet replaced it. And then many countries are experiencing populist movements, the root causes of which were anticipated in Kat Tully's remarks. But essentially what this leads to is an exacerbation of the difficulties we are experiencing in governance, because populist movements challenge established rules, established traditions, and they are also challenging the place the established elites play in governing the global system and national systems. Then there is something we haven't talked about very much, and that is the developments in communication technologies have given political actors, beginning with governments, the means to shape the public opinion, and also the means to intervene in the domestic politics of other societies in a variety of ways. So we have a tremendously destabilizing potential, the extent of which we are yet not fully able to appreciate. Then when we look at the economic domain, what we find is that the classical capitalism is coming under challenge, because the classical capitalism was based on the assumption that you have to keep expanding and producing. And then now we are faced with the question, can economies keep expanding forever without running into limitations imposed by nature, both in terms of resources, but mainly also in climate? Then we are also beginning to question the role of economic actors, beginning with corporations. Should they pursue exclusively profit maximization goals, or should they pursue social purposes that serve the interests of a variety of stakeholders? Again, this was anticipated in a different way in Kat Tully's remarks. And then, again, another point. Should the economic role of the government in market economies be redefined to ensure social welfare? Minimum guaranteed income or universal income, for example, free medical services, free education. Then there is something that we have briefly touched upon in other presentations as well, and that's the challenge of digitalization and automation. This has brought with it fear of widespread unemployment, protectionism, anti-immigrant sentiments and anti-minority sentiments in societies. And then, particularly with the pandemic, we have become more aware of the possibilities for new forms of work practice, working from home, less travel to hold meetings, etc. So I can just make this list longer, but some, if not all of these problems will be taken up during the various sessions of this conference. For example, I know there's a session on education where distant learning will be discussed, and there will be many examples like that. Let me turn actually to the panelists, because we have a very challenging and highly qualified group of panelists. And we have Steve Erlinger, who is a diplomatic correspondent for Europe for the New York Times. He's located in Brussels. Fyodor Lukyanov, who is the editor-in-chief of Russia in Global Affairs, and Viktor Kipiani, the chairman of GeoCase in Tbilisi. And I will start with Steve Erlanger and ask him about populism as a disruptive force in world politics. Of course, he is very, very much in touch with the populist cases in Europe, but that seems to be a good place to begin to judge the effects of the rise of populism in global politics. Steve?
Otto,
It's
hello.
nice to see you, by the way.
It's wonderful to see you. I'm sorry not to be there in person. It's a great pleasure, and I want to compliment Kat Tully too on a very interesting opening keynote. This is a complicated topic, and I'll do it fairly briefly. I mean, on one level, you know, we pull together a lot of different people under the rubric of populism. A German populist, someone who works or believes in alternative for Deutschland, is hardly the same as an American populist who believes in Donald Trump, or an Italian populist. I mean, Salvini, Kaczynski, these are different kinds of populism. And then we need to be careful, I think, not to patronize voters. I mean, voters who are voting as there's all their right to do, their unhappiness and distrust. But populism has been disruptive, and perhaps in a few minutes we can talk about why. The hard part is obviously to define populism. Cas Mudde, who's a Dutch political scientist, has tried to do that. He has a nice short book, a short history of populism, which I think is very useful. But by and large, it is people who feel left behind, who feel that they are at war with an elite which is unknowing and uncaring and selfish. They feel in this, strangely, are led to feel that they are the people, quote, people, unquote. They are the narod, they're the real people, as opposed to all these other fake people who are also voters, and their own leaders who clearly they feel do not represent the reality of the nation and themselves. And here it gets wrapped up, to me, into questions of identity and values. And here, this is where populisms differ, of course. But I think it is true if you, let's say, think of Hungary, or you think of Poland. We talk of these somehow as countries run by populists. In fact, since they're governments, it's hard to really say that. But part of what Viktor Orban and Kaczynski's brothers have done is to bring the countryside into politics. I mean, politics after the Soviet Union fell apart in these countries was very urban. Even, let's say, Hungary, the revolution in '56 was very urban. And Orban, as opposed to urban, Orban always made the claim that he and colleagues in the countryside were the real anti-communists, because they never really dealt with the regime, while the people who ran the '56 revolution were communists who thought better of it. And in Poland too, you have something that Vladimir Putin has also played with, which is a sense that they are deeply Christian nations, that somehow their belief system is being undermined, suborned by Western liberalism, that Brussels is not the center of their Europe, but the center of a kind of neoliberal, gender-bending, secular modern world, or which is denying God and denying their identity. And one sees this playing out. One sees the same kind of reaction in France as well, because very often, let's say in France, in the Netherlands, and now in Germany too, populism has devolved into a kind of anti-immigration view. And again, this is a sense that their world is under threat by outsiders, whether of a different religion, whether it's Islam or Judaism in the past or whatever it is, but these are people who are not actually part of the soil, part of the real people that populism supposedly represents. And you saw this, of course, in my own country. You could call it populism. I mean, I think there was a deep reaction that Donald Trump sparked and Donald Trump represented, part of which, you know, was a bit satirical, I have to say. I mean, if you listen to Trump, Trump had the pacing of a stand-up comedian. He was very good. He gave very good demagogic speeches. He was very good at touching sensitive issues and then dancing away from them and then touching them again. But what he did, this very odd man who was very wealthy, or presented himself as certainly very wealthy, who came from New York City, presented himself as the symbol and representative of the left behind, of the forgotten, of the real Americans who were being traduced by their allies, taken advantage of, overwhelmed by immigrants pouring through Mexico, hurt by China. I mean, the fact that most factory jobs have been lost not due to globalization, but to automation was, you know, a truth that cut across the reality of the world Trump tried to present, which was that America was full of carnage, it was at risk, he could protect them, he was the one who saw through all the illusionary nonsense of this globalized intellectual world, and he would protect the people, he would protect populism. So for all these reasons, it is a disruptive force, and it's something I think everyone has to be careful with. I mean, most prominently right now, the CDU in Germany and Emmanuel Macron in France, because both are at risk, I think, of being damaged by strong populist anti-immigration, pro-identitarian feelings. And both parties are toying with these issues in a very dangerous way, it seems to me, but one understands why. So there's also the problem, and here I will stop. I mean, if you consider, which I think many people do, not populists normally, climate change to be a real and present danger, something we actually have to do something about, as opposed to simply talk about, which is what we're very good at doing, then if you see with Trump and you see with the Gilets jaunes in France, and you see in other places this sense that no, environmentalism, doing something about it, is a project of the rich and the elite who will not suffer the way we will suffer, because we will lose our jobs and we will have our gasoline prices go up, and it will be very bad for us, but good for them. I think that's another danger. I think Western democracies certainly need to pay attention to. But again, I would stress, and this is important, however disruptive these views can be, they are legitimate, they are sincere. In democracies, they must be listened to and talked to, and not patronized and not dismissed, as Hillary Clinton once dismissed Donald Trump's supporters as a basket of deplorables. There are lots of people who are deplorable in the world, but they're not all populists. Some of them are actually leaders. And here I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. That was really a very good introduction to one of the major problems we're facing. You tied populism also with climate, which is interesting. Fyodor, nice to see you again. You're going to be talking to us, right, about the difficulties we encounter in the system of global governance. So in about 8 to 9 minutes, tell us what we can do about this, all right?
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Turan, and I'm fantastically glad to be here at this forum. Of course, it would be absolutely great to see Bosphorus in person, and I hope that we will be able to do it very soon. So I will next year, maybe earlier, hopefully. I will try to be very brief and to limit myself to a couple of observations. And thanks to previous speakers, brilliant introduction by Professor Tyler and by Stephen. I think I will start where Steve stopped, because from my point of view, first of all, populism, which has been emphasized so much in recent years, is actually not a problem, but a symptom, obviously. And the symptom of the new phenomena which started to be seen maybe 10, 15 years ago, that a big part of world population, and in particular in rich countries, most developed countries, they stopped seeing why this globalization and all those achievements of global leadership and governance, why on the earth they should support that, because they stopped feeling that it was in their for their advantage. Partially it was wrong what they believed, but partially it was right. And in the end of the day, populism was, of course, a very strong signal that something is going very much wrong in the global economy and global social life. Again, I would like to emphasize that the real danger, the real challenge to globalization came not from China, Russia, or Iran. It came from within the most developed and most advanced societies, which I think was quite interesting. In this regard, I think maybe it might sound a bit strange, but I think that the only region in the world where populism is a real problem and the real trouble is European Union, is Europe. Because European Union is based on the very idea that national borders should disappear, national identities should be merged into something common. And this is based on this idea. That's why it's extremely difficult to reconcile those social trends in different countries with the continuation of the European integration. We see significant trouble, and frankly, I don't understand yet how the European Union, the European establishment will be able to address it. As for other countries, as for nation states, be it United States, China, Russia, India, whatever, those who are who have sovereignty to to decide about their own future and their own policies, unlike European nations, which are bound in this very interesting community. So in those countries, I would guess that populism, or you might call it differently, but this is a natural phase in development, because we see that pendulum is swinging back and forth everywhere, from more openness to less openness, from more internationalism to less, to more sovereignization. And that's more or less normal political development in almost any country. So in this regard, I think that people like Donald Trump or those who are being labeled as populists, personally, they might disappear or weaken or maybe be back, but it's not about them. It's about the spirit in societies. And my guess would be that establishment will change. So under this influence, establishment will try to as Stephen mentioned, problems in Germany and France, that establishment is trying to address those feelings from the societies. And that means that establishment will change towards less global vision and more national understanding. I think that pandemic made, it was not a reason for changes, but it was just a catalyst. And now we cannot deny that all those problems with international order started much earlier than 2020. It was actually after the end of the Cold War, but for quite a long time, euphoria, which prevailed mainly in the West, but also partially worldwide, that overshadowed those problems. People believed that those problems might disappear with time automatically. So now what I think is the main consequence of pandemic is that domestic affairs, domestic troubles will become the most important, vitally important issue for all governments in the world, obviously and objectively. So every country has such significant challenges inside. Political, social, cultural, economical, any. So protectionism, I mean, to encapsulate and to try to address those issues, that will be a more or less natural reaction to all those challenges. Any government feels now how vulnerable the state is becoming. Again, not necessarily the least sustainable countries as before, they got used to that. But the most sustainable, most developed or strong countries, be it United States, European countries, Russia or China or India, which believed to grow and to expand. But now they will need to shrink because they need to, first of all, to address domestic issues. And I would say that protectionism in broader sense, not just economic protection, but broader sense, political, cultural, social protectionism, to focus on own population, that will be the main priority for everybody. What does it mean for international leadership? I mean, I believe that it will be much more difficult to force governments to cooperate. It's not impossible, but much harder to achieve. And I think we can envisage a new understanding of multilateralism. Multilateralism, as we understood it in the late 20th, early 21st century, which was actually synonymous to globalism, to global approach to particular issues. Now it's different. Multilateralism of today is that interested countries or governments, those interested cooperate to address particular issues which are important to them. And it might be 2 countries, 3 countries, 5 countries, not at all the world. And I think it's a significant change because it will create a completely different world. Sovereignization, as it was mentioned by Professor Tali, will move to areas which before were seen as totally internationalized and globalized. I mean, internet, for example. The question about who controls data. We see that this question is arising not just in Russia, China, Iran, or Singapore, countries with special democratic record, but first of all in countries of a very deep-rooted democratic tradition. Look recently this struggle between Australia and Facebook. And I think that combined, that will create a completely new international environment, which is not bad or good. It's just a new quality of international system. And what we should do, we should not let us be distorted by growing gap between words and deeds. I think it's extremely important because big countries in particular, Russia, US, China, some European powers, they will try to demonstrate, to imitate international engagement by words, by statements like Joe Biden doing, America is back. But in fact, they will shrink and they will focus more and more on domestic issues, which is okay, but we should just not be fooled by what they're saying. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fyodor. Victor, how are you? Nice to see you. And this morning earlier, one of the introductory speakers referred to the idea that we were in a situation where we could not move on to the next stage of global development without a war. I think this was sort of stimulated by observations of how we got out of difficult situations during the First and Second World Wars, maybe. But would you care to comment a little bit about the global security structure? Let me also just add that we have about 10 minutes. I am informed that strictly at 12:25 our time, the president of Turkey will steal the stage from us, so we have to conclude by that time. So thanks a lot.
Dr. Turan, thank you so much indeed. It's really my pleasure to be speaking at this very insightful, very prominent summit. So thank you so much. Well, much was said about this new wave of global instability and disorders, and many reasons and factors were given as a helpful analysis on a quite regular and routine basis. And definitely, they give us a good chance, a fairly good chance to provide with the right diagnosis, if you will, on what has happening with the global instability and what that instability means and how it has to be cured or addressed this time. But for the purpose of these discussions, I would rather avoid repetitions or reiterations, which are well known. And let me please briefly go through those reasons and considerations which, in my view, have triggered what we are all facing these days. And when pointing out to such in-depth triggers, if you will, my view that those triggers have a common denominator, and they bear one and same semblance. And this connotation probably is quite vague and quite obscure, but I would call it a disruption of cohesiveness. Well, our world has never been cohesive enough, and this notion is quite relative, as you could appreciate. The Cold War provided for its own cohesiveness when laying down a unique structure of international relationships. The structure was predominantly premised on a near hard-faced conflict of two global powers, but with enough diligence not to cross certain red lines, and having a structured, fairly well-oversized system of proxy wars. The global lot was simple and straightforward enough, although some reasonable intricacies and intrigues were admitted. With the end of the Cold War and dismantling the old structure, however, a whole range of extremely challenging, as we say these days, new normals and brain teasers in regional and international relations and securities have started to emerge. The notable salvo signaling that some remnants of deterrence, of keeping at last a semblance of cohesiveness and predictability, were disappearing with 2008 war between Russia and Georgia, and with a closing act that the old rules of game were finally over was annexation of Crimea. In a very short historical span of time, we witnessed a process of, say, creative destruction, along with emerging and re-emerging threats, but new opportunities too. But the problem is that there is still not enough indication that a new set of standards are under construction to bring a fresh wave of healthy cohesiveness into the global edifice. My personal view is that the next major rupture, when speaking about cohesiveness in terms of underpinning stability, predictability, and reliability for the global order and security, is an excessive fragmentation of the world system pursuant to multiple non-connected regions, each representing, if not completely independent, then almost independent policy-making center. Not to mention that implanting such policy based not just on perceptions only, but on misperceptions as well. Well, a regionalization is surely not bad. Moreover, it brings clear advantages with certain regional design. But when it's implemented in hasty and irrational way, that could lead the regional process into murky waters of real threats and challenges. The recent events in the Nagorno-Karabakh, leaving respective parties and stakeholders with a rather complex and multi-layered ceasefire agreement of November 10th, is an example of somewhat contradicting interests and expectations that could backfire in at some future point in time. Next two factors, in my view, which undermine the global security order: changing peaceful means for resolving trade and commerce disputes by coercive means, and doing that in bad manner and an unabashed degree. Trade wars, sanctions, embargoes became a most frequently used language for the diplomacy of new normals, which leads to more fragmenting the global bonds, bringing in visible disruptions and making a healing process as much painful as one could possibly theorize. This was an unfaithful toolkit for diplomatic dialogue, or I would rather say non-dialogue at all, coupled with a process of retailoring up to some people's understanding, creatively destroying the global supply chain on a massive scale, clearly adds to wide-scale security system distortions too. Last but not of lesser malign impacts for the overall security and order is a disconnect between the state and its nationals. More the so-called laissez-faire the state has become over the last years, whether in relation to safety and order, speaking about policy making when it comes to acting as a true stakeholder to drive a national economy, or ensuring a much needed social safety support, more porous and vulnerable our civic composition became vis-a-vis various populist, radical, and extremist forces. This very fatal process for alienating a given society from its own state institutions, making the former highly self-driven, while the latter dangerously detached, presents a deadly blow to the global security and tears down autonomous cohesiveness of national security cells. As I mentioned, this is a summary of the innate causes of the ongoing instability and looming bigger disorder, with various other manifestations, conflict, terrorism, illegal migrations, and other wrongs. But those are boiling down the surface for some time already. But how to right the wrongs? Remedies could be various, and advices are plenty these days. Let me mention just a few. Some go to very basic but well-forgotten skills of international politics, which are also badly required for any success when attempting to rebuild a new stability edifice. And those are expertise, honesty, respect, and goal sharing, but not necessarily value sharing. Next, since every large edifice starts from blocks, the latter are putting regional and sub-regional orders in a proper way. This task is even more important when taking into account that the modern world became so multipolar, and this world reflects an emergence of various regional centers of gravitation. One among those is clearly the Black Sea region. These days, there are many discussions and initiatives to put the region in a proper perspective. From my standpoint, let me please raise a proposal for any further discussions, and that proposal is about signing a framework document under the name of the Black Sea Declaration. The declaration will emphasize how essential is the Black Sea region for the world peace and stability through helping to reach peace and stability in the region itself, among other possible issues.
Victor, if I could sort of politely jump in for just 1 second, Ilter Turan, if I could ask permission to take the floor for a second. Victor, sorry for cutting you off. I'd like to hand the microphone back to Mr. Ilter Turan so you can pick up where we left off. Do apologize. Thank you.
No problem. No problem. Well, pleasure to pick up after the president has spoke. Well, I mentioned that one of the initiatives is about signing the Black Sea Declaration, and my closing statements that the declaration will emphasize how essential the Black Sea region is for the world peace, and will provide for certain initiatives for reaching peace and stability in the Black region itself. Among other possible issues which I would propose for the declaration to cover is about underlying importance for regional security partnerships, speak of the region as a free area from malign influences and special zones of interest, emphasize a requirement for concerted efforts for mobilizing funds to diversify regional infrastructure and promoting socially and environmentally sustainable projects for the region. Besides, touch on frozen and prolonged conflicts, as well as express support for independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of countries in the Black Sea region. Provide for regional venues for deliberating on regional security, and last but not least, emphasize on importance to open discussions on regional free trade agreements and trade associations. Ladies, thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen, for giving me the time to express my views on the topic. Happy to discuss any of the issues, and many thanks indeed, and good luck to the Bosphorus Summit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor. And I would like to take this occasion to thank Kat Tully, Steve Erlinger, Fyodor Lukyanov, and Victor Kipiani. I think the discussion was rich. And in fact, I came to think that there should have been more time for discussion, but we will reserve that for a real person meeting next year. Thank you very much. In normal meetings, we would say, let's give them a big hand, but they might not even hear it. So we thank them genuinely for their contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much to you and your guests.